I said, it's 6 weeks tomorrow. I'm pretty sure that's right, to the election, the general election. A widely anticipated election, but then all elections are every 3 years, to be fair. And I'm sure that there'll be breathless reporting that, polling stations are being flooded by people. But I'd be interested to see turnout this year. Of course, there's a lot of early voting. That must be starting soon, in about a couple of weeks anyhow. But joining us to talk about this, and obviously a sort of fractious last week at Parliament, but there's a lot on the line, so I guess it would be, is Labour's Tairi MP, Ingrid Leary. Ingrid, welcome to the show. Before you even start, I just wanted to say I started this morning by praising your government over having a grocery commissioner and the grocery code of conduct announced today. I think that's a really good first step.
Thank you, and yes it is. And I sat on the select committee which worked on that.
Oh, did you?
We worked really collegiately, actually. I give credit to National Party MP Andrew Bailey. Him and I in particular, I think, worked to make sure we were both very determined that the legislation that went through had teeth.
Yeah.
The danger with these things always is that you introduce legislation, the devil's in the detail in the regulation, that somehow the organisations that are supposed to do the job are not empowered. And we went over it with a fine-tooth comb. We looked at things like, in particular, the contractual arrangements that the big duopoly could have to try and get around the legislation. And we feel that, I certainly feel we landed in a good place as far as having an empowered Commerce Commission and legislation that does have teeth, and we will see a difference for consumers who have been paying that $1 million a day excess profit to those two big players in the market.
As I said in the introduction to this issue this morning, they are robber barons, old-fashioned 19th century robber barons at the end of the day. And it's been too long that central government has let them have, access to us to rip us off on a daily basis. Why has it taken so long? I mean, I'm not criticising you. As I said in my introductory remarks, 9 years of National, they did nothing about this either. It's taken 6 years to get to this stage. Gee, I mean, we've known this has been a problem for decades. Why do you think? Is it the lobbying power of the supermarket chains in Wellington?
I think it takes a certain amount of political bravery. And I do think that this is the natural landscape for left-leaning governments, because we are more likely to acknowledge market failure. We are more likely to want to put things in place that level the playing field. So we would expect this to be something that a left-leaning government in particular would take seriously. They do have lobbying power, and I think also the legal contractual arrangements around land caveats and so on, those things evolve insidiously over time to the point where they become, I guess they're like weeds in the garden that strangle the big trees. It's not something that happens overnight. It happens over time. And then there has been a lot of kicking the can down the road. And, the previous national government did know this was happening, didn't do anything. We've tackled it. It does take a while because you need the independent report from the Commerce Commission to take the politics out of it. And then you need it to go to a select committee so you can get cross-party support, and that's exactly what's happened.
So that's answered that question. So if there's a change in government, there's going to be no bonfire of that particular agency?
I don't see that political. Well, you'd have to ask the Nats, but I don't. I think they would be supportive because, of course, at the end of the day, everybody wants good competition. I think there's all-round consensus that there has been market failure, and the difference between the political parties is what interventions or not do you use to promote competition.
All right. That's a positive outcome. I mean, that's what we expect parliamentarians to do, is to get together a little bit more than they do, to be perfectly honest with you, and make those sorts of things happen when there is clearly something wrong. This, though, is still an election in 6 weeks' time. It's getting fraught, obviously. It always does. I mean, there's people losing jobs, people gaining jobs, all those sorts of things in the balance as well. From your perspective as a left-leaning Labour Party MP, how did you see this week playing into the build-up to the election?
Look, I thought it was really predictable. The National Party have been saying for a long time that their platform will be around tax cuts. They've left it to the last minute, so I guess, from a political perspective, my view is they've left it so that we can't do too much scrutiny to see how those tax cuts stack up. But what we do know is there's a gaping big hole in them. I'm hoping we can cross that soon. In the fine print, it looks like there will be cuts to health and education. So the conversation you were having earlier about polytechnics and university, that's not going to get resolved if there's cuts in those areas. The housing tax that they're proposing simply won't work for two reasons. One is it's assuming that every second house over the price tag of $2 million will be bought by a foreign investor, but probably more importantly, the main people who normally buy, the Chinese, are exempt under the current law, so and the agreements that we have with them. So their numbers don't stack up. And so my thing is, this is a typical policy play from National, uncosted fiscal hole, and kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. It looks attractive on the outside. We've got time, though. We've got 32 or 31 days till early voting to make sure people read the fine print and realise that those tax cuts don't stack up, especially for lower income workers.
But I guess, how it's funded is interesting for the Beltway in Wellington. And obviously for political operatives in the media, possibly. But from average people, if they said, listen, I can get an extra $120 a fortnight through tax aid, that's my bottom line, isn't it? I'm happy with that.
Not really. Not if you're somebody who relies on the free prescriptions or free and half price transport like people on My Electorate. Not if you stand to get $138 in your back pocket as a woman who may want to go out to work, who's got a 2-year-old, who now can realistically have that choice. Those are the choices that people have to make. And when you're on a lower income, you might stand to get $20 a fortnight rather than 100 and something. And then look at what you're getting in targeted support. That's the math that people need to do. So I think that people do need to be interested and are interested in what they stand to lose by looking at these tax cuts and saying, where's the real benefit?
But now, if we're talking about fiscal holes, let's be honest about it. The GST off fresh fruit and vegetables and fresh and frozen. That's a disaster. Every political tax commentator, including people on your own side, have said this will not work in terms of delivering real support to those struggling with cost of living here.
And I have had... We've had this conversation, and it's part of a 10-point plan. It sends signals to low-income families that they can afford fresh fruit and vegetables. It has to be looked in the totality. And so, when people are looking, it's not GST off fruit and vegetables versus tax cuts on income. It's where is the targeted support, what about the free transport and so on, and the apprenticeships and the healthy lunches and the winter energy payment and all of that versus tax cuts. And let's be real, if National get in, they would need ACT there, and ACT want to take an even bigger cane knife to public services. So those are the choices.
Well, let's talk about that actually, because it's both parties, National and Labor, clearly identify what I could only consider to be significant fat in the public sector in this country. Grant Robertson this week saying, or I think on Monday, $4 million or over $4 billion over 4 years they've identified as excess, if you like, spending or taxpayer, if you like, relief that can be offered to us all. Is the public sector's grown like Topsy over the last 6 years, Ingrid, and I'm struggling to see better education, better health outcomes, certainly not better law and order outcomes. And the public could reasonably say, couldn't they, what have we got for our extra money, all these extra staff? What better services are they delivering?
Yeah, and you've opened a can of worms there, because this is I've got personal views about this, and certainly where I've sat as the Chair of Finance and Expenditure. I believe that the current accountability mechanisms across government and Parliament are so fraught that it's very easy to throw around numbers and say, we're not getting value for money, and nobody can actually say whether we are, and that's because we're counting outputs rather than outcomes, and because our parliamentary term is so short, where the fastest lawmakers in the West, as Sir Geoffrey Palmer said, we're implementing policies. We're not giving them time to actually deliver on outcomes, and we're not measuring outcomes properly. Now, this is the Auditor General's been saying this. There's a recognition of this, and I applaud the work that Grant Robertson's done around creating clusters to try and get some of that accounting done better. But the real question shouldn't be how many people are in the public service. The real question is, are they getting value for money? And you can't have it on both ways. You want a grocery commissioner. You want the ComCom to be empowered to be able to look at this market and other markets. Well, that takes expertise. You know, we had the ComCom...
I concede what you're saying there. Ingrid, I concede what you're saying there, and there is a shortage there, and you're absolutely right. We do want you to beef up that area. But let's just take a look at education, the Ministry of Education, and all the ancillary policy staff that have been added to that over the last 6 years. I mean, have there been better outcomes for teaching in this country? No, demonstrably not. Every statistic points to an education system in decline.
Yeah, actually, I truly think that the education outcomes we're seeing currently, many of those have come about through the imposition of national standards that happened some years ago under a national government. Policies take time to achieve outcomes positively or negatively, as you well know, and so to say now that this is the result of 6 years in government, I don't think...
Ingrid, you're not seriously blaming national standards for the decline in New Zealand education. I mean, your own party this year, along with the Nats, and again, this would seem to be a relatively common policy, have identified that we have a curriculum that is not being uniformly taught in this country, and that there are serious teaching inadequacies for the basics of our education curriculum. You've actually admitted that, or at least your minister has, just in the last month. Isn't that the real problem?
That's why you need people in the ministry to be able to make reform. And the difference politically, of course, is that we are a progressive side of the house. We do believe in reform. We do believe in market intervention where there's market failure, including in public services. And that does take more people power. The real question, as I say, is where is the value for money? And I don't think that anybody can truly answer that question until we reform the way that we have scrutiny in Parliament and the way that...
Well, does that mean Grant Robertson got it? Well, does that mean Grant Robertson got it wrong when he said, right, every government department's got to take a 1 to 2% cut? Well, I mean, that's clearly going to affect staff, isn't it?
Yeah, but any household periodically adjusts its budget. He did not call it fat in the system. It's a belt-tightening exercise because we're in an inflationary environment. We do need to lead by example. We do need to take into account the impacts of what's happening in the global economy, and so there is some belt-tightening. Now, that doesn't mean those things that we're losing are wasteful fat. They are things where there's a prioritisation. We've seen that before. That's a fiscally responsible thing to do. It's what households do. And any government worth its salt does that over periods of time to make sure that they're projecting correctly and that they're not going to end up with a budget deficit.
Yeah, except the problem is you've identified, I mean, you've been in power for 6 years, Ingrid, and the argument is, right, there's enough to take 1 to 2% out of most government departments in terms of the belt tightening that you've just talked about and Grant Robertson did. But again, you've also identified we don't know that that's going to improve outcomes or not, do we? Because as you say, there is no measure. So, I mean, it's still a pretty, arbitrary method to say, I just want you to cut out 2% of your budget, when at the end of the day, we don't know what impact, if any, that's going to have on the effectiveness or not of those departments, yeah?
Yeah, it's not mutually exclusive, though. At the same time, there is work going on to make sure that those performance measurements, which have been, in my view, lacking for decades and decades, there is good work going on, both within the ministries, also at the nudging of the minister, and also with the oversight of the Auditor General and some of the work of finance and expenditure to say to ministries, please define your outcomes better in terms of outcomes, not outputs. And this is why it's so frustrating listening to some of the questions in the House from the opposition who seem to be quite obsessed with outputs. Now, to be fair to them, it's very difficult in the current system and the way things are measured to actually say what are the outcomes. We need to be able to do that over time, and I would refer again to the really good work done by the the Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton, who's done some world-leading work in terms of saying how do we look at specific measurable outcomes, not loose, woolly ones. How do we gather the data and how do we track them over time so we can see a trend of performance improvement or performance decline? That's what needs to happen in my view.
Okay, and that's fair. Listen, Ingrid, that's fair enough. But, you've had 6 years at this. You'd think you'd be making some progress in that area. I mean, that you can't tell me in 2023 that you're spending $1 effectively when you came in 2017. There's a bit of a correlation there, isn't there?
Yeah, you have to look at the big picture. We came in after 9 years of what we would describe as neglect. We came in where we were wanting to lift the minimum wage and close the inequality gap. We had COVID, we had the war in Ukraine, there's been natural disasters. We're trying to implement things to acknowledge the impacts and adaptation on climate change, where very little work had been done in those areas. So when you look at the total picture, that's a much fairer picture to look at. You move into a house that's run down, the first thing you've got to do is fix up the house and then try and also build the resilience, and that's what we've been doing.
I mean, like I said, I think I understand why you're running this line, but after 6 years of being in power, you can reasonably expect that your policies will work or not, that they'll stand the test of time. You can't go, whatever the faults of the National Party the 9 years previous, you'd expect that there would be an upward indicator of all these things if your policies are working, yeah?
Yeah, and there certainly is. If you look at the ANZ Business Outlook, highest levels of confidence since June 2021. Moody's Investor Services have reaffirmed our AAA rating for the economy. Fitch has done that. Every indicator is up in terms of business confidence, about profitability expectations, ease of credit, employment, and so on. These are all indicators that New Zealand is doing well. And it's very easy, as you know, to sit in the opposition benches and to hurl rocks and to promise tax cuts that are not funded properly because there's no accountability for election promises, which is exactly what the National Party is doing. So I think that it's also interesting to look at, yes, there are cost of living pressures. Absolutely, we acknowledge that. We are turning a corner, but to suggest that the economy is in a bad shape is simply irresponsible in my view. They are not the same thing. There's been really good stewardship of the economy through very difficult headwaters. We're turning a corner. Spring is coming. The outlook is good. That, of course, is going to make a difference to cost of living. And it's just irresponsible of the other side to try and conflate them and say, based on no evidence, that the economy is flailing when it isn't.
Okay, all right. Forget the National Party for a moment and ACT. Just go to an independent arbiter like, polling agencies over the last month. Now, they suggest, when they've all been asked those questions, and it's irrespective of who've been asking it, that is New Zealand tracking in the right direction or the wrong direction? The wrong direction is well ahead on that particular issue. So doesn't that mean that average New Zealanders have a problem at the moment in the way in which government is moving?
Yeah, I think average New Zealanders have bought into some of these really negative narratives. That's my personal view. Our polling actually shows that at the moment the left side of Parliament could form a government. It's going to be neck and neck. It has been all along. And, when people are in echo chambers of negativity, it's not surprising that they pick it up. I know when I call my constituents on the phone, when I'm calling people who are probably marginal voters, and they might have a sense of, they're not sure, probably they'll vote Labour, not sure. I say, so what is in particular you have an issue? They can't put a thumb on, they can't put a finger on it. Now that suggests a culture of negativity that I believe has come about through a media narrative, and you and I have talked about this many times. So all I do is encourage people, make sure you get 360 degrees on your information so you can make an informed choice. It's the best we can do in this climate of negativity.
No, listen, I'm on your side 100% on that one. I think it's critical to do a 360 spin. But having said that, sometimes, and you remember 3 years ago, there was a mood. And there was a mood that swept Labour into the most extraordinary results since Mickey Joseph Savage came in 1935. It was that extraordinary. And National could have done all they liked. They could have said to everybody, listen, we'll give you $100 each for the rest of your life, extra on top of what you get, wouldn't have made a blind bit of difference. Do you detect the same mood there or not?
No, I think it's much more even than that, and that's because I do get out and talk to ordinary people, not only in my electorate, but when I'm out and about in other places. I make it my business to supermarket shop and to chat to people. The other thing, I guess, is that I've lived in countries where democracies have been fragile and things have got really bad. What worries me is, especially speaking to the unions, and the prospect of ACT being in government with the National Party, for example. ACT would go after the unions, for sure, but also the type of economics and the type of business model they would want to run for New Zealand would basically see a stripping out, in my view, of workers' rights. So the type of Uber situation where you've got, Uber drivers who've got virtually no rights, get a tiny cut of the profit, completely unprotected, that is the type of employment relations system that they would want across every sector in New Zealand, and that is what keeps me up at night. I think New Zealanders don't actually really understand how bad things can get from a worker's perspective. And remember, as a left-leaning Labour government, I am interested in the workers, the hard workers that keep New Zealand running, and particularly our critical workers.
But it does, and I guess the strategy, what I've noticed in the last 2 weeks anyhow, is that Labour are running very much, and when you talk about negative, a very negative strategy. You are saying, listen, if this lot come in, and the Council of Trade Unions have almost they're starting a campaign, I think, next week on this, if this lot comes in, things are going to get really bad. You think they're bad now? You wait till this lot get in.
Michael, it's not a strategy from my perspective. This is the line I've been running continually. This is why I got into politics. And remember, I work at the coalface with the people who are on the very thin end of this. I have phone calls with, and this is true, I have phone calls. I had one the other week with a woman who was nearly in tears, so traumatised by the idea of potentially losing the winter energy payment because she used to go to bed at about 4:30 or 5 o'clock every night because she couldn't afford to put the heater on. I also had back-to-back 2 phone calls, one with somebody who I would say was one of the super marginalised, who had pretty much lost complete faith in the system, Māori, misdiagnosis in the health system, had a son who was suicidal. I had to almost work very hard to be able to get my office to reach out to her. I was deeply concerned. And then on the next phone call, I had a really lovely, really reasonable person from Mosgiel who chatted away but was really upset about all this money being splashed around to the Maoris. And, and said, I'm not racist. One of my relatives is Maori, but blah, blah, blah. Now, what's missing in all of that, I think, is the reasons why we're doing things and the understanding from people who don't see that level of deprivation of the difference these policies make and why we're doing them. And at the end of the day, when we all do well, everybody does well. I would much rather have somebody who's marginalised working than pay for their amputation in the hospital because they've got diabetes at the age of 21.
Ingrid, I reckon that the day after the election, and if you do lose, you'll sit round in that caucus and you'll say, you know what our primary problem was? We didn't explain sufficiently what we were doing, so we couldn't make the public case for the changes that we made. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Look, I think there's a lot of truth in what. So I reject the premise that we'll lose. I feel very confident we will get this because there are real people out there having real conversations and who knows what this means. But as far as the narrative goes on particular areas of policy, particularly around co-governance, I think that there has been a need to explain better and to take people with us. But I also blame the fact that we have not had the history in New Zealand schools, and that goes across the board, whether it's Māori history, Pacific history, or our farming history, and the issues that our farmers had to face over, some of them have had farms in the family for 150 years. We need to sit down as a society and have that conversation so that we can better understand each other. So that's the part of the kernel of truth that I think I agree with in what you've said.
Just as long as it's conversation, not indoctrination. I think there's a worry of using the history curriculum to pursue an ideological end rather than a historical fact, don't you think?
No, yeah, it needs to be histories. I've always said it needs to be histories. It needs to be a sharing of histories. I mean, again, I see no difference between doing this as a society and sitting down as a small group of people and how we would conduct ourselves, say, in a street. You know, you have your neighbours, they might be from a different culture or a different financial situation. You reach out, you get to know each other, you share stories and conversations. It shouldn't be one-way traffic either. That's how we get to understand where each other comes from and what we can contribute to make the street better for everybody.
Ingrid, thank you very much for joining us. What have you got planned for this weekend?
Oh, the Labour launch in Auckland, of course.
Oh, is it the Labour Party launch this weekend, is it?
Yeah, and National in Auckland as well. So there'll be a lot of good politics for you media people to chew over on Monday.
Is that happening on Sunday? Yours is Sunday afternoon, I presume?
No, Saturday.
Right. Okay. Best of luck to you. Have a good time in Auckland. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks very much for joining us.
Always great to chat to you, Michael.
You
Great.
too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. That is Ingrid Leary, the Labour MP for Taieri. Well, you've heard the conversation. Your reaction, obviously.